Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new. It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people, and to the still larger cause of humanity.
Hello and welcome everyone to India Colonised A Podcast dedicated to South Asia's colonial history. I am your host, Omer Haq, and today on our next episode of Guftagu, we have with us Dr. Kate Imy. Dr. Kate Imy is a historian of culture and war in British colonial Asia. Her first book, Faithful Fighters, Identity and Power in British Indian Army, examines the culture and anti-colonialism in 20th century British Indian Army. It has won the NACBS Stansky Prize and the Pacific Coast Branch Book Award of American Historical Association. Her next project considers soldiers and civilian experiences of the war in Singapore and Malaya. She is currently the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, 2 CLS Awards in Hindi and Urdu, a fellowship from the Institute of Historical Research in London, and another grant from American Historical Association. Here is our conversation with Dr. Kate Imy on a book, Faithful Fighters, Identity and Power in the British Indian Army. Hello and welcome, Professor Kate Imy, to India Colonized. We are absolutely thrilled and glad to have you on our podcast. So before we begin to discuss your book and get down to discussing the themes of your book and the questions that I have, I wanted to ask you about, so that you can introduce yourself to our audience. So if you could tell us a bit about yourself, the kind of intellectual journey you've had, what were the kind of influences like books or people or academicians that have influenced your journey so far?
Sure. So first, just thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here. I think what you're doing, the intellectual project that you've built is really admirable. So congratulations on the fantastic work that you're doing. I'm very impressed also because you mentioned that you are kind of coming out of your undergrad and looking ahead to a master's, and to have accomplished so much so quickly is quite admirable. My journey was a little bit slower than that. I started in college initially at the United States Air Force Academy. So I was expecting at that point in time when I was, 17, 18, to have a career in the military. And within a year, I realized it was the wrong fit. I was very much an arts and, performance and literature and history kind of person. So I went to community college. I worked through my undergrad, was fortunate to get into some master's programs, was able to work as a TA. So my circumstances were very much wedded to my intellectual growth. So I went to, public schools throughout, which was great. I met a lot of different people with different life experiences, which provided, I think, a very unique window into academic life. And then it was in that kind of bachelor's to master's transition where I started to get interested in a lot of British authors who wrote about India. And I was like, okay, well, what happens if you dig into that relationship a little bit more and start to, understand other sites of intellectual exchange? So I was thinking about the army and militaries as a site of, potential intellectual exchange. And what happens if we focus not on, high-minded authors, but on, men who are in the rank and file together. And, came across a couple of British men who learned yoga or claimed that they learned yoga during their time in India. So I was interested in those histories and really just, I became very influenced by post-colonial studies, by subaltern studies, histories from below, gender history, histories of the body, and thinking about, okay, how can we apply those histories again to a military and ask different questions about the military? Because I think, my very brief experience of being in the military sort of for 1 year opened up a lot of questions for me. At the Air Force Academy, for example, the central building on that campus is a chapel. And so, thinking about the relationship between faith and the military is, I think, a very important one, not only for the United States, but also globally, and thinking about how these colonial legacies shape how militaries are born, which expressions of faith get institutional support and which ones do not. And so I think those are questions with global resonance that continue to inform my.
I'm sorry. So yeah, I was telling that was really fascinating because I've always wondered about how they always have a chaplain or an imam. They're always recruiting religious leaders to the army, and where they actually teach you to actually have your um, affinity and the kind of obedience to the state, but they're also making sure that they are very closely related to their faith and the faith is maintained as well. So before we also go into studying getting to know your book well, so what was the journey like to come across to write this particular project, like this book about Indians in the World War and their relation with culture and faith?
So it was an interesting journey. I think I started with that question with those British men who claimed that they did and learned yoga in India as soldiers. I was like, okay, what does that mean? And then kind of came to learn that both of those men became British fascists, which is a surprising political lean, I think, especially thinking about what cultures and kind of countercultures and subcultures yoga tends to occupy in the US now, tends to be a little bit more lefty, a little bit more pacifist. So, okay, what does it mean if you have British fascist men doing yoga? So that for me opened up, okay, there's something interesting going on in the military. So I wanted to look at those cultural exchanges in the military and said, okay, what's the best way to do that? And that's through soldiers' personal stories. So the journey to write the books had to start with specific case studies of individual men. And throughout, I prioritize, like, I can't just have this be a history of British men writing about Indian soldiers. Like we've kind of seen that. That's the history that has existed since colonialism, which is, British officers writing about the men that surround them, and not necessarily getting Indian soldiers' perspectives of those encounters, of those exchanges, of those debates, and of their service and what it meant to them. So I initially started and was able to find a lot more easily some case studies of British men who, there was one man who converted to Islam or tried to convert to Islam before a chaplain kind of stepped in and prevented him from doing so, and found all these kinds of case studies. But then I also found a lot of oral histories from the Imperial War Museum, which were very helpful because they have a great database. And I think, especially now when we're living in a time where there are so many travel restrictions, something I certainly encourage my graduate students to think about is find out what's out there that's been digitized, that's accessible anywhere in the world. Because I think, unfortunately, travel restrictions like this will be with us for a long time. And of course, these are building on older national ideas about who can travel where, and these kinds of things are getting stricter and harder, and access to archival materials is very unequal and inequitable. So I think for any students out there listening, do as much as you can online, because there are some really valuable resources, and Imperial War Museum is one of those places. And they have a lot of digitized oral history interviews with Indian soldiers and veterans particularly. So I was able to go through, and a lot of these these interviews took place 30 to 40 years after these men actually served. So of course you have to deal with questions of memory and things like this. But it provided me with a lot of great insight about how soldiers themselves understood cultural exchange and how the Army shaped that. So the journey for this project involved finding the sources first for me, because I wanted to make sure that whatever history I wrote was legible to, or could have been legible to the soldiers themselves, that soldiers themselves wouldn't, if time travel existed, wouldn't pick up my book and be confused and say, what is she talking about? I wanted soldiers' voices to be, my starting point, and then to build my arguments from there.
Well, that's fascinating as well. Something that I always want, one of the questions that I want to ask you is kind of the methodology with which you approach these sources in these archives, and how is it different to what's already done in academia, or is it different? And if so, how is it different?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I'm lucky, and we are as scholars are lucky to be living in a time where people are asking great questions about the military. I exist in conversation with a lot of fantastic authors like Yasmin Khan, who wrote about the Second World War, Sharbani Basu, who is a journalist and has written about the First World War and Indian soldiers. Shantanu Das has written many wonderful works about Indian soldiers. Particularly from a cultural lens, thinking about art, thinking about song. So I'm existing in conversation with these scholars as opposed to necessarily in opposition to these scholars, because they've been doing fantastic work, and there's a lot of really rich and interesting work happening with culture in the military right now. So we're all very fortunate to be doing this type of work. For me, I'm a very story-driven historian, so I'm very interested in people's individual stories, their individual experiences of service, and how individual stories can open up wider truths and wider understandings of colonial dynamics, of cultural dynamics, of what it meant to live, work, and serve in the military. So I tend to start with these stories, but then I'm, very informed by, as I kind of alluded to earlier, histories from below, post-colonial studies, subaltern studies, histories of the body, thinking about the body as not a fixed object that never changes over time, but one which is, deeply immersed in all sorts of things like food, weather, access to comforts that, tell us a great deal about the societies and the worlds in which people lived. So I see myself as, deeply committed to the archive and the sources, but also trying to bring a theoretically informed approach so that I'm not just, for example, taking for granted that what British officers write about their soldiers is true. I doing a lot of reading against the grain, thinking about, okay, what type of things could this soldier or this officer be hiding? What else might have been going on? What other sources can I put in conversation with official reports to get a slightly different texture and nuance to it? So I try to be fairly eclectic in my approach. I see the work that other scholars has done as a kind of debt, and I tend to approach other scholars' work with gratitude that they did a lot of work that I now don't have to do, but at the same time try to always lead with the sources and make sure that whatever I'm bringing to a particular topic, that it is something that feels informed by a broad source base, but is also in conversation with what other fantastic scholars are also doing.
Well, by the way, I must tell you, I really appreciate the way you've built the narrative in the book and how it is building around. It's quite much like you emphasize that it's story-like, it's gripping to understand. It's kind of like a page turner. You
Thank
also
you.
mentioned about the capturing of nuances that you were trying to do with the different narratives that you were trying to come across about the soldiers and what already exists and what the British officers have written about the soldiers. My question to you was, what were the kind of limitations that you came across while accessing the records of these soldiers or the voices of these people? Because, I mean, that's probably not the most prominent of the voices that are there out that are being studied.
Absolutely. It's something you always face as a scholar, is the there tend to be very unequal amounts of archives available with different voices. So, I think it is very much possible, not necessarily advisable, but possible to write a history of the Indian Army that uses exclusively British sources, that exclusively uses official reports, because there are dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands of pages of these things, like Indian officer or British officers who served in the Indian Army, they left behind oral history records. They left behind, in some cases, 300-page published and unpublished manuscripts. So it's like there's an overwhelming volume of material from British perspectives. And I do say perspectives plural because, not every British officer or soldier had the same experience. And, one can certainly do good work and interesting work looking at the subtleties and nuances between them. But for me, it was always important, and not just important, but essential to foreground the hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers. But like you said, it's challenging and it's a choice. If you have, especially with as a graduate student, limited funds, you have 3 weeks in the archive and you have 2 days left before you have to get on your flight and go home. And you kind of think to yourself, I can either in that time go through these 15 files of official British reports, or I can intensively study this one, Urdu manuscript that I have to go through a little bit more slowly because, the pages are worn and the script is maybe faded and I have to go through it very meticulously. So I think students are always making those choices. And for me, it's worth it to put in the time to dig into the sources, to look for the sources, to find the sources. But you do have to put in the work. And so thankfully there are other sources that exist that make it a little easier. So the British Library, for example, has censored Indian letters that people like David O'Missy have made great use of over the years, where Indian soldiers would write to their friends, their family members, but British censors would take those letters and make sure they weren't giving away vital information about a battle or about the movement of troops, or in some cases that they weren't sending information back home, like, oh, service is really terrible, don't let my brothers enlist. They want to also prevent those kinds of things from getting back home. So you have to read sources like that with a grain of salt, and with a very careful lens, because the sources that remain have been translated, transcribed, and generally excerpted. So you're dealing with a translator who may or may not be British or Indian. Translators came from all different walks of life. And it may or may not have been their first language. So translation is always tricky, and you're dealing with an English translation of something that was not produced originally in English. It's usually excerpted, so it's taken out of the context of the letter, and usually 1 or 2 lines as opposed to, a 2 or 3 page letter. So you have all these problems with sources. And I think in some cases people are tempted to say, oh, well, that's not worth using because the source has all these problems. But, for me, it's like, if this is one of the best ways you can access Indian soldiers' voices, you have to use that source, and you have to apply the same rigor that you apply to that source to the official report, in my opinion, because the official reports also are excluding information, they're excluding perspective, they're crafting a narrative, they're creating a story. So I think anytime you approach any source, you have to be very careful. And, the official reports, there are so many of them, they go on forever. And same with, individual testimonies. You have to be as careful with those sources, even though they might be, easier to read, or they might be typed up and very nicely organized. You still have to be careful with those sources. So, that's sort of what I would recommend. And those are some of the challenges that you have to overcome. And then, of course, anyone that's been to the Indian archives, the National Archives of India in particular, knows that sometimes the sources you want didn't get transferred, or they haven't been preserved. So if you fill out a slip, you often will get an NT, meaning not transferred. And it's the bane of every scholar of South Asia's existence, because some of those sources don't exist. So you have those things happen. And then I went to 12 different archives across India. So I wanted to be, as eclectic in my archival approach. And then with each, new place, you're learning a new institution, you're learning the personalities of the people that work there, and that applies wherever you go. So certainly there were challenges no matter where you went, and no matter what type of source you were using. So encouragement for anyone starting off is that it'll be hard no matter what you do.
It's definitely been a labor of love, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. You have to really be committed to telling the story you want to tell.
Yeah. So obviously you've probably come across many sources and a lot more interesting things. Has there been anything that you've probably not been able to include because of publication restrictions, that you were like, okay, this should have been really part of the book, but I haven't been able to put that? So if there's something like that, what would be one thing you would want the audience to know, that, it was going to be a part of the book, but unfortunately could not make it?
Yeah, so I was fairly fortunate as a graduate student to get a lot of time to do research. And so I was able to spend like a year in India and a year in the UK to just focus on research. So what ended up happening was that there was a lot of material that I didn't have time to get to for my dissertation, that then when I was doing the dissertation to book, I actually added things in that transition. And then I was fairly lucky with my publishers, with Stanford University Press, that when I submitted the manuscript, they felt that the organization I had chosen was appropriate and correct. And, they didn't have any big suggestions for changing anything. And they didn't think that anything needed to be cut. So most of those choices sort of fell to me. And one thing in particular that when I was in the archives really resonated with me was the story of the Singapore Mutiny in 1915. And so a lot of people have been writing about this recently, including like Heather Street Salter, just wrote a great book on World War I in Southeast Asia, where she talks about the Singapore Mutiny of 1915. And that was, I came across hundreds of pages of documents on this, including hundreds of pages of Indian soldiers' testimonies, many of which were kind of ignored when the official reports were comprised. And so I found that distinction really interesting. But for this book, for Faithful Fighters, it fit. And I talked about the Singapore Mutiny in various moments in kind of smaller ways. But I really wanted to dig into that story and look at the difference between Indian soldiers' testimonies and the official reports. And I wasn't really able to do that for this project. So it actually became the starting point of the second book that I'm now working on, which does look at warfare in Singapore and Malaya, with the Singapore Mutiny as a starting point and sort of takes it forward from there. So thankfully, it's something I was able to continue with, even though I was very disappointed I couldn't spend more time on that in that original book.
Well, there's something, it's a project I would be looking forward to read soon. I hope it comes out soon. So one of the things before we actually dive into dissecting the themes of your book, for the sake of our audience, could you state what are the themes in the book and what is generally, briefly and generally covered, what is the subject of your book is?
Sure. So the book is called Faithful Fighters. So one of the questions that's really interested me is what it means to be faithful in all of its variety of meanings. So from a colonial lens, being faithful to the government has a specific set of meanings. And of course, that's usually funneled through narratives about loyalty and fidelity and, fighting hard to the end and staying loyal to the government. But for Indian soldiers, I think it has a much broader meaning. They are simultaneously navigating loyalties to their friends, their families, their communities, as well as the government or their individual officers that they may or may not feel some kind of personal connection to. So thinking about that and the many meanings of loyalty and faithfulness were interesting to me. And then also just putting the military in conversation with faith and the many meanings of faith. So I deliberately use faith rather than religion, because I think there's a lot of great work in anthropology and religious studies, people like Talal Asad, and the list goes on, Edward Said to an extent, about how this word religion has been used and manipulated, and particularly during the colonial period fit kind of altered to fit various different contexts. So the idea of Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism being a religion, that concept didn't necessarily exist prior to colonialism. There were a variety of faith groups, sometimes regional, sometimes local, sometimes familial. All of these understandings of belonging were very pliable and could actually cross borders of faith. So, if you were what would be considered Hindu now, living next door to a Muslim, those faith groups would actually intersect and relate to one another quite a lot. Prior to and even during the colonial period. And those traditions would inform one another. And so I think like Purnima Dhawan's book on When Sparrows Became Hawks, looking at the rise of the Sikh Khalsa during the kind of Mughal, late Mughal, early British colonial East India Company period, is a fantastic work that looks at some of these questions of how faith groups in some cases define themselves in opposition to one another, but also very much in dialogue with one another. So that's, the idea of what does faithfulness mean? How is religion used as a category? And what can we gain by looking at the culture and the history of the body of the military? These are some of the questions and the themes that for me animate the book. And then in terms of topic, I wanted to look at the early 20th century in the British Indian Army, because for me, this is a period where you have several things happening simultaneously. You have the formalization of the British Indian Army. So through much of the 19th century, the old East India Company designations of Bengal Army, Madras Army, and so on, like that, those still kind of existed until the late 19th century. But then by the 20th century, the turn of the 20th century, you see a formalization. You see more articulations of the Indian Army as an Indian army. And so there's this desire to unify. There's this desire to bring these units together. And this is happening against a backdrop of Indian anti-colonialism, really intensifying in different visions of nationalism, formalizing and hardening and coming into existence or taking new shape. And then this is also happening against a backdrop of world war, a war to an extent that these soldiers haven't seen before. Many soldiers have been to war. Many of their fathers and their grandfathers have been to war, but they haven't been to a war quite like this, and certainly not to the extent. Peacetime or so-called peacetime Indian Army tended to range in number between 150,000 and 250,000. But during the First World War, you have 1.4 million soldiers and civilians serving. So that's just, such an extreme acceleration of just raw numbers, and also varieties of experience, men serving from the Western fronts to ports like Singapore, to Mesopotamia, to Arabia. It's just a vast variety of experience in a very short period of time. So this intersection of anti-colonialism, rising nationalism, global war, and new articulations of faith groups, to me, is very fascinating. And so looking at the military as the kind of nexus of these questions is something that I haven't really seen done before in this way, like really looking at the army as the center of a lot of these debates.
Yeah, absolutely. What makes the book interesting is how it's moved in so many backdrops and the fascinating intersection of these backdrops that have been. Generally, I think that's one of the shortcomings of our education in history here, at least in India, is that we're always taught these things in isolation, that none of these, it's always imagined that this is happening in isolation to the other incident, the anti-colonial movements, to what's actually happening in the World War. It's not actually touched the World War, and Indian participation is very rarely spoken of. But even if it does, it's not usually happening in the idea, okay, the anti-colonial movements that are happening in the background, what is the context and how the soldiers were reacting to it, and what was the interaction with it. So coming to the first three chapters of your book, which kind of have a similar kind of theme of between different communities, and how the British colonial power was basically, it had certain conceptions and preconceived notions about a certain community and its martial race. You also talk about the martial race theory. Coming to the first chapter where you talk about the Sikhs, there is, so what were the kind of conceptions or preconceived notions that the colonizers had about this particular race, and what were the kind of debates that were going between the community, and how were they shattered, if they were?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that I had to engage with just inherently because of the topic is this idea of the martial races. It's one of the dominant ways that people, if anyone has heard of the Indian Army, one of the first things they say, there are a few things, like sometimes Amritsar will be the first thing they bring up. Sometimes 1857 will be the first thing they bring up. But the martial races is usually right there as well. Like, oh yes, of course, Indian Army, that was, because all the Sikhs and the Gurkhas, they were the strong ones sons. And so they went to war and, because they were natural soldiers and these kinds of things. So even now in the 21st century, a lot of those preconceived notions still exist. And I think for reasons that were very deliberate at the time. So for the Sikh community in particular, a lot of the ideas about why these men made natural good soldiers was rooted and wrapped up in the formation of the Sikh Khalsa in the 18th century and earlier. And when the Khalsa became its own empire and really rose to prominence in the 18th century, it created this idea in the minds of a lot of East India Company officials that, oh, wow, there's this warrior fraternity of men who exist, who are forming their own empire. And that's amazing. And then, of course, the East India Company took on the Khalsa Empire at various moments, eventually annexing Punjab in the 1840s. And so this created this narrative, it already kind of existed of like, oh, these are the big, strong soldiers. But that really became formalized and legitimized in 1857 when a lot of these soldiers recently incorporated, by choice or by force into the East India Company's territories. A lot of them lost their livelihoods with the annexation of Punjab into the East India Company's territories. So, of course, if the East India Company says, hey, fight on our side, we'll give you a good paycheck and we'll give you lots of land. A lot of these men who are unemployed because their armies have been dismantled are say, okay, fine, we'll fight on the side of the East India Company because that's our option. And that created this narrative of loyalty, which of course it never was. Sikh men in 1857 didn't say, yes, we love the British, so we're going to fight for the British. But that's the narrative that was built around this service in its aftermath. So because Sikh participation was, relatively large and prominent in 1857, that built this idea that, yes, these are the most loyal and steadfast soldiers. The reality was, of course, far more complex. As I mentioned, a lot of soldiers aren't joining the East India Company because of blind loyalty or devotion. It's rooted in all sorts of different material contexts and the very recent annexation of Punjab. So that continues into the late 19th century and beyond. British officers are constantly writing, oh my gosh, my Sikh soldiers are talking to members of the Arya Samaj, or they're creating their own groups, or they're isolating themselves, or they're protesting, or they're meeting up with Irish soldiers and they seem to be communicating with them, or they're traveling to the northwestern border area with Afghanistan, present day Afghanistan. And so there were all these things that these soldiers were doing that seemed to betray British soldiers' understanding of them as natural and loyal soldiers, and that kept happening. Nonetheless, British officers kept trying to perpetuate this idea of the naturally loyal Sikh soldier. And so one of the things that they really emphasized were the 5 markers of identity associated with the Khalsa warrior fraternity, which included carrying a sword, or called a kirpan. And so this was, of course, interesting because if you were an Indian man in the colonial period, you couldn't bear arms without a license, a government license issued by British authorities. So there's this inherent contradiction where if you really want to be a martial man, part of your community, you are supposed to carry a sword, but you have to have a government license in order to do so. So the British are trying to recruit as many men as they can who wear these 5 markers of identity. And it creates some issues because if they are serving in the military, well, then yes, they can, maybe have access to swords. But in many cases, if men weren't serving in the military and they did identify with the Khalsa, they'd have to wear a pin on their pagris or their turbans. And so there were all these ways and all these contradictions that existed with trying to forge what the loyal man looked like, and therefore recruit him into the army, with all sorts of unintended consequences, to the point that by the early 20th century, there are a lot of Sikh reformist organizations like the Tat or the True Khalsa that said, yes, that these markers of identity are essential. And if you don't wear these markers of identity, then you aren't really Sikh. And so that became a kind of community-based issue of contention that the army was implicated in. And then who had access to weapons became another bigger problem, especially as we get into rising anti-colonialism and a lot of people saying, hey, we can have these swords, let's use these swords to take on the British, which of course the British then did not like and tried to restrict the size of swords. So things proved to be very complicated the more central they are to political discussions.
So was it the reason, I mean, out of context, was that the reason why a long sword became like a small dagger, which the Sikhs would carry around?
Yeah.
Right.
So in a lot of British officers found, and a lot of, Sikh soldiers found, was that when they looked at paintings of the Khalsa Empire, they'd see rows and rows of men, carrying swords that were 3 feet long, and they'd be like, so we should probably have swords that are 3 feet long, right? But increasingly, like, police reports will be like, saw a Sikh man come into the market today with a 4 foot long sword, made us a little nervous, so then they have to start, like, or they imagine that they need to start legislating, like, okay, like 4 feet too long, 3 feet too long, 18 inches debatable, and so like 9 to 12 inches becomes like the ideal sword size. And this ends up happening regionally. So different regional governments will actually put in their own restrictions. And so what you'll see is that in places like Bengal and Punjab, where a lot of anti-colonial activism is high, those tend to be some of the places that put in the restrictions the earliest, because they want to make sure that in these places where people are, very upset and very active and very vocal, and very organized, because I think anger wasn't necessarily regionally specific, but they were better organized perhaps in different places. Those are the places where you see the legislation come the fastest. But then it's also tricky, right? Because Punjab is a major recruiting ground. And so you don't want to upset those, military families that live in that area. So that's why you see different regional responses. And then, sometimes the government of India says, no, it's okay. Everyone can have a sword, and like try to impose what those lengths of swords are. But again, on the ground level, it tends to go in 100 different directions.
Wow. So about the Sikh community itself. So how was basically the Sikh community perceiving about the entire recruitment process for World War One, and how was it responding? Because they are, I mean, Khalsa is a very deeply religiously affiliated army. So fighting for, say, someone of a different faith, and how they're responding to how this is actually going on in the Europe. It's a conflict that does not concern them, but ultimately it might have not only just been for materialistic reasons, but other reasons that they might have thought of. So what was the thought process of these soldiers, and what were they going through while this recruitment was happening? How was their response to what was happening in the war and the other things?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things to really learn about and dig into for me was just the variety of responses that soldiers have. There is no Muslim response to the war. There is no Sikh response to the war. There is no, Nepali Gurkha response to the war. Within these communities, there's disagreement, there's dissension, and individuals within the same family might feel very differently. Like the famous case of 2 Muslim soldiers who were brothers, one of whom ended up deserting and one of whom, won a medal for the British. So you have this incredible variety of response. And so this exists within the Sikh community as well. There are certainly some soldiers who say, hey, this is great. I've been training since I was a young man to be in the military. My dad was in the military. His dad was in the military. And, we are maybe landowners now because of military service, or we have certain material advantages because of military service. And now the British are saying, I'm going to go to war and I get to go to Europe, which is not somewhere that, my dad got to go. So that's pretty cool, because like I get to go to Europe and I get to see a new place. So, just that kind of thirst for adventure was a motivation for some men. Some men definitely had a kind of spiritual or faithful response, which is like, hey, if I believe I am a part of the Khalsa and it is, a Khalsa Sikh's duty to serve, here's an opportunity to do that. So it's not inconsistent with, it doesn't matter what the faith of the ruler is. It's my opportunity to honor my faith and go to war. So some men would certainly have those responses. Some men would be a little bit leery and say, all the things you mentioned, like, wait, this seems really far away. And especially, if men who joined in say 1916, they hear vague stories about like Germany attacked France and Belgium, and like, okay, we've heard that the Germans are kind of bad guys. So why are we going to Egypt? Or, why are we going to Arabia? They haven't necessarily heard the Ottoman Empire part of that story and how the British are expanding their territory because of this war. And they're like, wait, I thought it was the Germans were the bad guys and they were invading. So why is it that we're trying to dismantle this other, so soldiers would certainly get leery for a variety of reasons as well. Like, why are we going somewhere completely different? Like, oh, my buddy last year, he went to war and he got injured and that was pretty awful. And I heard the trenches are pretty bad, but like the French families were really nice to them. And so that's cool. And I want to go do that. But instead I'm going to like Mesopotamia, which I've never heard of. I don't know where that is even. And then when they get there, they're like, wait a minute, the climate is not great. And the sanitation pretty awful. The food very bad, like, so soldiers would have all sorts of reasons for being suspicious, for being upset. And then certainly, political considerations would come into play as well. So in the early 20th century, something that people like Maya Ramnath have written about quite extensively, and Gajendra Singh, I think, he wrote a great book on Indian soldiers in the First and Second World War. He's writing now, I believe, on the Ghadar movement, meaning mutiny, which was very prominent in the early 20th century, which was a kind of global anti-colonial network rooted in the northwestern North America, basically. So Northern California up into Vancouver in Canada. That was sort of the base, but they kind of moved globally and had a lot of traction in Southeast Asia, places like Singapore, and tried to reach out to soldiers' families, veterans, migrants who had any kind of connection to the military, and tried to say, hey, there's something wrong with the British Empire. Maybe it's not the greatest thing for India. Maybe we can rise up. And if we can recruit enough soldiers, maybe we can convince them to lead the charge. And so, we know this isn't something that happened successfully in the First World War. There are certainly efforts to stir rebellion within the army in a variety of ways. It's much more famous in the Second World War, when the Indian National Army kind of becomes the manifestation of anti-colonialism and fighting against the British as opposed to for the British. But there were efforts during the First World War. And so there are a lot of Sikhs in particular that are connected to this Ghadar movement that spans the globe. And in fact, a lot of them are the first that these revolutionaries will reach out to. A lot of them themselves are members of the movement, or their family members are members of the movement. So there are soldiers that are connected to that are politically aware and want to fight back. So, for me, I think really understanding that there isn't just one response to the war, even within the same community. There's a whole host of responses that are all existing simultaneously. And British leaders are kind of trying to define within that, okay, let's try and make it as clear cut as possible. Who's loyal? Who can we trust? Who needs to get kicked out? And in so doing, kind of muddying the lines between what people's actual responses were, which were quite complex.
Okay. So, the same probably applies to all the communities, Sikhs, Muslims, and the Nepali Gurkhas.
Absolutely.
But as you mentioned about how the Ottoman, they were not aware of what the British was doing with the Ottoman Empire. I was first. The audience should probably be fascinated to know about how the Muslims were responding when it came to the war, especially because they were being pitted against fighting fellow members of faith. How were they reconciling with fighting someone for, say, Christians were probably often considered as infidels, and then fighting for, say, the Queen on behalf against the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire might have been something that might have been troubling. Again, as you said, there might have been multiple responses to this. But my major question was, What about those who were in contention to what they wanted to do, and how were these contentions resolved by the British? So how were the colonizers basically managing these contentions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say, like you correctly anticipated, Muslim identity is vast and complex. There are many, regional identities, regional complexities and nuances, depending on, where someone is from. It informs their understanding of their belief, but certainly does not determine it. Just because someone is from somewhere and had access to a certain set of teachings doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they'll interpret the world. But to your point, which is, soldiers that are in contention, there absolutely were some soldiers who here, okay, within a few months of Britain going to war with Germany, they're going to war against the Ottoman Empire. And India and the Ottoman Empire had, there were some really important connections between them, because the Ottoman emperor held the position of caliph, the head of global Islam. And so a lot of Indian Muslims would look to the Ottoman Empire as, a source of spiritual inspiration. So now all of a sudden, Britain is going to war with them, and that becomes pretty problematic right out of the gate. And certainly was something that British leaders were worried about. And so people like Gajendra Singh, who I mentioned earlier, have, written about this very well. About how in the early months of the war, there was a lot of concern on the part of British officers. And there were isolated events that took place that, furthered their concern. So the Singapore Mutiny, for example, was a rising that happened in Singapore, and most of the soldiers were Muslim. And so the reality of that event is quite complex, but the way that British leaders interpreted it at the time was that, there were problems, and these soldiers were afraid they were going to have to go fight other Muslims, and that was why they rebelled. The truth far more complex, but that was the narrative that emerged from there. Similarly, there were higher rates of desertions among Pashtun or Pathan soldiers recruited from the northwestern borderlands. So that caused some concern. There were instances of some Muslim soldiers refusing to set sail if they were being sent somewhere like Mesopotamia, where they were going to be expected to fight against Muslim soldiers. So there were isolated moments like this, and soldiers certainly would take the opportunity to say, no, like, we're not doing this. And so to your point, British leaders are kind of having to improvise in the moment. How do we keep these soldiers disciplined? How do we keep them fighting for what we want them to fight for without necessarily forcing them to take on the Ottoman Empire, at least explicitly? And so, one thing that's also worth noting, I think, is that although there are these famous incidents, there were, probably at least 400,000 Muslims serving in the British Indian Army as soldiers and as followers. The vast majority of these men, don't rebel, they don't rise up, and so I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about these instances of desertion that are very well documented. There are these instances of dissension. Usually there's more going on than just a single cause for people to rebel, for someone to kill their officers, for example. Usually there's more than one reason. And a lot of times the material conditions would come into play there. So what British leaders would do in response was that they would try to find ways to appeal to soldiers and say, okay, yes, we are sending you to fight in the Ottoman Empire, but when you get there, we really want you to protect some Muslim holy sites that exist there, because the Ottoman Empire might destroy them, and so kind of trying to say, you are going there as protectors, you are going there to help other Muslims, as opposed to you are going there to fight other Muslims. So creating a new story and sort of rebranding that service became very important. And then what I talk about in the book is that in the later stages of the war, and even in its aftermath, the geographic proximity to where a lot of these soldiers are serving is quite close to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And so British officers will organize official pilgrimages to these holy sites for their Indian soldiers. So again, it's trying to create this idea that, you are faithful fighters, you are just soldiers, you are honoring your faith in your service, and your service is helping you do that, rather than focusing on like, okay, you're taking on the Ottoman Empire, which holds the position of the caliph, and you're fighting other Muslims, erasing that narrative and instead saying, no, you get to be protecting other Muslims. You get to be protecting Muslim holy sites. You get to, undertake one of the major pillars of Islam, and by doing the Hajj, and so it's a way of rebranding that service and saying this service is compatible with your faith. Therefore, if you fight for the British Empire, it makes you a better Muslim rather than making you an infidel, for example.
Well, that is fascinating, how they would convert it to becoming a rather turn it in perspective of religion, rather than villainizing the Ottoman Empire and telling them, okay, this is why we want you to fight the Ottoman Empire. I mean, that could have been the narrative. They could have made a propaganda and told the Indian Muslims, okay, this is not what your caliph stands for. So
they did that also. That certainly also existed, which is a kind of demonization. And like one thing they would do is they'd be like, oh, look how bad Mecca and Medina look under the Ottoman Empire. Like, look how poorly maintained these sites are because of, so they certainly did that too. They would, they would do the typical thing, like emphasizing atrocities, that those kinds of things existed as well. But I think just the massive scale of mobilizing these ideas of faith, because it takes a lot of time, energy, and money to send, hundreds and thousands of soldiers on pilgrimage, and so I think that became a major source of support for them, which is why they invested the time, money, and energy into it.
And probably they had to, because they had a war going on. They had to have the soldiers on their side. So in the same chapter, you discuss the case of the Pathans and discuss the problem of the empire about valorizing masculinity, and how that was also in conflict with the rebellion. So they had to keep the army disciplined while at the same time not valorize it so much. And probably not just in the particular case of the Pathan, but mostly even in other races as well. So that was one question about, how they used to valorize it while also remaining deeply suspicious. And also the other question was about the fascinating case and figure of Captain Mosey, if I'm pronouncing that right. I wanted to understand this case in order for our audience and for me to basically assert some of the opinion about the sort of intricate happenings in the colonial space of what's going on with regards to sexuality, or with regards to certain other ideas of being of the individual.
Yeah, so really great question. So the issue with the kind of Pashtun Pathan identity is that during the colonial period, the Pathan identity was regarded as one of the martial races. And so, this is dealing with a community predominantly of Muslims recruited from northwestern India, the borders with Afghanistan, so modern day Pakistan. And so the martial race idea is that, because these men come from a border area, which has, an inhospitable landscape, that this made them hardy and strong, but also slightly dangerous, slightly inclined maybe in a British frame to being too devout or, too committed to, their beliefs and practices. And then similarly, there was a narrative of, because, there was a perception that there were fewer women in this area, this made these men inclined to having sex with other men. And, interesting, there's a great book that is coming out now called Imagining Afghanistan that engages with a lot of these similar kinds of narratives. And so, these narratives haven't gone away, unfortunately, but in the colonial period, it was used to simultaneously recruit and demonize these soldiers, according to the needs of recruiting officers. So many of these men weren't actually colonial subjects, especially if they were, born or lived outside of colonial borders, but they could nonetheless be recruited. And so this created a kind of weird intermediary position. And so, in times where they were valued, hey, yes, they're strong, they're good fighters, So they're desirable for that reason. But in times when, these men would rebel or desert, and again, in many cases, it was because their homes were being taken over while they were away at battle. So they would desert to go back home and help their families. Nonetheless, the British tended to see any act of desertion or any act of rebellion through a religious lens. So, if they're deserting a rebellion, it must be because they are, fanatics, to use the scare quotes on that, the British word on that. So there was a lack of understanding that kind of pervaded the recruitment of these men. And so you have someone like Captain and then demoted Lieutenant Moisey stepping in, who's kind of picking up these narratives. And, he's in, I believe, having sex with some of these men and ends up getting implicated and participating in anti-colonial networks and activities, which were fairly common along the northwestern border. There were plots based in Kabul trying to unify German and Ottoman revolutionaries with Afghan revolutionaries, and then also Indian revolutionaries, to try and launch an invasion into India, which would kind of come true by 1919 with the Third Anglo-Afghan War. There would sort of be an effort to try and oust the British, but by then, the war's over, the moment has kind of been missed. The British can now reorient the Royal Air Force with very devastating consequences in this region, but so it kind of fails. But nonetheless, it shows that there were these kind of wartime efforts to bring revolutionaries together in places like Kabul and foment revolution there. And so someone like Moisey is participating in this and tries to, and as a British officer, is trying to lead a rebellion with the assistance of various Pathan, as they were known at the time, soldiers, which kind of confounds the colonial state, because a British officer is the last person in their imaginary who should be rising up, who should be trying to take on the British Empire. It's the British officer should be the most loyal, who has the most to gain, who has the most faith and belief in the British Empire. And, he is the person that is leading a rebellion. And so I kind of take his case and break it down and say, yeah, there were, of course, British officers who saw what was going on, who had a lot of questions, who wanted to push back against all these inequalities and inequities. But also they had the privilege to do so. They had more access to mobility. Their movements were in some ways more scrutinized, but in some ways less scrutinized, because they could always sort of explain their way out of a situation. If an Indian soldier was caught talking to the wrong person, they could end up in prison. If they were caught with a seditious pamphlet, even if it was just because somebody handed it to them on the docks and they didn't think about it and they threw it in their bag and they maybe couldn't even read it, if it's caught in their stuff, they could go to prison for that. So there was such a small amount of leniency when it came to Indian soldiers that if they did the smallest thing, they could lose their jobs, they could find themselves in prison. Whereas a British officer, this guy, he literally tries to kidnap a general's daughter. He breaks another man out of prison using explosives, seemingly. He kind of does a whole range of things that never really get him in trouble. And you're just sort of how and when, and at what point will someone hold this guy accountable? And it never really happens. Eventually, after all of these things, he has a few months in prison, which is already unheard of for a British officer, because the fear of the colonial state is that if you see a white man being held accountable, then that kind of throws into doubt the benevolence and the paternalism of empire, that these are the men that know what they're doing and are always going to be just. But if you put one of them in prison, oh my gosh, that throws the whole racial hierarchy into chaos potentially. And so he's put in prison, which is already quite extreme, and then he's actually banned from India after that. And sent to another part of the empire where probably, he continued, I would imagine, but that the archival trail kind of drops off at that point. So yeah, he kind of reveals that this idea of the rebellious Pathan soldier was a colonial fantasy, and that no one could carry it out better than a British officer who had the mobility, who had the power, and who had the lack of accountability to pull this off, because, other revolutionaries are certainly active, and they're certainly able to evade capture in part because of colonial racism and things like this. But his name exists, his legacy exists because he was able to get away with so much for so long, and had a fairly limited amount of prison time as a result.
Well, that is a really interesting story. I hope someone is at least writing a book in detail about the entire case of Captain Mercy. So, coming to your next chapter about the Nepali Gurkhas and trying to understand them, you mentioned that they were mostly seen as, the colonizers saw them as more loyal and more steadfast when in comparison to the other races. And why were they seen to be so?
So one thing that I think is fascinating about the Indian Army is that there was so much diversity within it. And so this is one good example, like the Pathan, Afghan, Pashtun soldiers were considered disloyal because they lived on the borders with Afghanistan. And it was like, okay, well, where did their loyalties really lie? But like the exact opposite argument was made for Nepali Gurkha soldiers, which is like, oh, okay, they are citizens of Nepal, but they're choosing to fight for the British. Therefore, they love the British. And, like, so it was like the exact opposite argument, like because they had these other loyalties, it made them somehow better. So, interesting how those things work out when you want them to. And so in their case, one thing that the kind of martial race recruiting trope always emphasized was that they were Hindus who didn't care about caste. So in this, there's a few distortions happening. One, not all Nepali soldiers were Hindu, or would have identified that way. And then the other was that they didn't care about caste. It's like, well, what does that really mean? And so in my chapter in this book, I look at the issue of Panipatya, which involved a kind of purification for crossing the black waters of the ocean, which was an act of impurity. And so in theory, if the colonial narrative is that, Nepali soldiers don't care about caste, then crossing the black waters of the ocean should not have mattered for them at all. But what happens is actually the opposite, that Indian Hindus are expected by the British to cross the black waters of the ocean and then to just kind of get over it. Whereas with the case of Nepali soldiers, the Nepal government is actually putting pressure on the British government and the military authorities to ensure that these soldiers are getting purification ceremonies when they come back, to the point that they're actually sent to Dehradun in northern India to have these purification ceremonies. It becomes an official part of their service. Even if they're injured, even if they're dying, even if they are desperate to go home and find their family, first they have to go to Dehradun and stay there and get this ceremony first, in which case, they often, like, they have 2 weeks of leave and they spend 2 weeks going up there, and then now they have to go back and they don't get to see their family at all. So the colonial narrative is clearly betrayed because the Nepal government is creating all of these complications. And then, of course, some of the men do care about this practice, some of the men don't care about this practice, and it creates all of these additional fissures and fractures, because Nepali men are sort of looking around and they're like, wait a minute, you say that we don't care about caste, but you're forcing us to do this caste ceremony that we don't even necessarily practice. Like, how does this make sense? And so, of course, revolutionaries in the Gadar movement, for example, find out about this, go to Dehradun and start recruiting to these men, and it creates additional anti-colonial networks because of this desire to invent, create, harden a practice that soldiers may or may not have even cared about. So yeah, it's another way that these ideas about soldiers tended to be very different from the reality, and then the making diverse beliefs and practices into a kind of bureaucratic norm created all sorts of problems as well.
Thank you so much for explaining so intricately. I was actually going to come to the question about what were the kind of preconceived notions that the British had that were going to go, that they had wrong. So let's continue to your next chapter where you explore the questions of dietary patterns of each of these communities. Especially what I found interesting was the idea of namak halal, the loyalty to salt. So, for the sake of our audience, if you could like explain the idea of namak halal and how dietary habit, especially salt in the imagination of Indian soldiers, the World War played an important role in. If so, what was the kind of role?
Yeah, so this concept is really interesting. The idea of basically owing your loyalty to the salt of the government was how it kind of became understood in the early 20th century. And so it had earlier precedents in, the Mughal armies, in particular, where the idea was that whoever fed you, whoever kept your belly full, that was the person to whom you owed your fidelity, your loyalty. And so, it was understood earlier as a kind of mutual obligation that as long as you were being treated well, you would owe your devotion to whatever entity was giving you your sustenance. And so you see some continuation of this with communities that had served the Mughal Empire. So a lot of Muslim soldiers would use this. Rajput soldiers who had served in some of the Mughal armies at various points would often use this as well. But it had sort of permeated much of South Asian society by the 20th century, so that to the point that you see Hindu soldiers and Sikh soldiers using this kind of terminology as well. And so in a lot of their letters home, soldiers would say, I am fighting because I owe, because of the government's salt, because of the loyalty that I owe to the government, because they give me my paycheck. And so it has this imaginative power for a lot of soldiers, that it's a duty that they owe to the government because the government sustains them and sustains their family and keeps them alive. However, by the early 20th century, there are a lot of other issues going on with food. There have been massive famines that have affected a lot of areas of India, especially Punjab, in the early 20th century. Horrible famines, horrible plagues through much of the turn of the 20th century period. So a lot of soldiers are like, wait a minute, do I actually owe my loyalty to this government if this government has been depriving my entire community of food, of sustenance? Does that change the relationship? But again, because a lot of British leaders interpret everything as strictly religious through that kind of prism, they often focused a lot of their attention on religious criticisms of food in particular. So kind of singling out high caste, Brahmin in particular, soldiers as being bad for military discipline. So if there was any sort of food-based critique or criticism, they would say, oh, it's probably the Brahmin's fault. And if a Sikh is doing it, or if a Muslim soldier is doing it, oh, it must be because a Brahmin soldier or Hindu soldier got to him and convinced him to do this. So again, ignoring the sort of wider cultural resonance, ignoring the material conditions of these soldiers' service and their variety of reasons for being upset. And then, of course, throughout the chapter, I kind of show that, like, even though they claimed to dislike, high caste Brahmin food practices, for example, and portray them as bad for military discipline, in a variety of ways, they would, make sure that Muslim soldiers, for example, had food that was halal. And they would make sure that Nepali Gurkha soldiers, participated in the Panipatiya ceremony, and that they would actually get written reports from any hospital where a Nepali soldier was stationed, and officers would write, oh yes, everything was fine and no soldiers complained. Now, of course, whether or not you buy that is a whole other thing. But nonetheless, they would go to the trouble to get the report written so that they could prove to a Nepali authority, like, see, these men had good food, they liked their water, and everything was fine. So it was sort of left to individual soldiers to complain, which soldiers, in militaries generally aren't given the opportunity or encouraged to do so. So yeah, food was yet another thing that British officials tended to understand one way, South Asian soldiers tended to understand in a different way. And through the military, they're trying to kind of flatline this rather complex issue and just say, oh, it's just about this kind of faith-based objection, therefore kind of ignoring the longer issues around food.
Okay. So I mean, a little off the topic, and just a question that I had was where you mentioned, I mean, you've mentioned that multiple times through the conversation, that the British always try to view things through the prism of religious identity, that they're probably doing it because they're religiously motivated to do so. So like my question was like, why did they choose to look through that lens of binary rather than acknowledge what was the multi-layered reality of that time? Like, why was this insistence? Was there some sort of insecurity that they had probably after 1857, or I don't know, I'm just guessing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really big and important question that kind of gets at the nature of what's wrong with colonialism in general, and problems inherent in militaries and governance, which is that governance is about trying to control populations in many instances, and with colonialism, it's imposing a form of governance that's rooted in a place that's far away from where the governance is actually taking place. So there's this kind of inherent distance between the ruler and the ruled, the governor and the governed. And so what that has tended to mean in the case of the British in India, but I think also more broadly, is that there becomes a kind of shorthand for how do we control populations as easily as possible. And very early in British colonialism, and I think especially because a lot of East India Company so-called founding fathers of India, again with the scare quotes, a lot of these foundational East India Company British and European leaders were coming to India during the time of the European Enlightenment, where in theory a lot of Europeans are casting off and questioning what religion means for European society. And they're trying to say, no, it should be about science and rationality and categorization. That's how we can understand the world, and by documenting and creating categories for what things are. So a lot of these kind of Enlightenment inspired individuals are going to India and interpreting what they see as, wow, this is a very religious society. So again, kind of using a word that has a specific meaning in Europe and applying it to India. And so when under the East India Company, they're trying to say, okay, we need to create legal codes that can help control these populations, they see religion as being a kind of foundational aspect of Indian society and culture. So if they want to control those populations, they need to do it through faith-based communities. And so that is a trend and a tendency that's established in the early days of the East India Company that carry over. And because of events like 1857, even though there were rebels of various different belief systems, because the Mughal Empire was a Muslim entity, and that a lot of the soldiers rebelling in 1857 were Muslim, that became another way to say, okay, we need to say that there's something particularly wrong with the Mughal Empire, and that Muslim soldiers are maybe distrustful, they're untrustworthy right now. So maybe Hindu soldiers are better, and then Hindu soldiers become worse as the 19th century goes on in the minds of the British officials. So maybe Sikh soldiers are the best. So it's a constantly evolving pattern of how can we determine who is loyal? How can we determine who is disloyal? And if the baseline understanding is Indians are religious, that's always the kind of go-to assumption that these British leaders have, because there's never a lot that shakes that underlying assumption, unfortunately.
On a lighter note, colonizing someone seems like a really tough job to do for a country to come on a foreign land and colonize an entire land and population.
It doesn't work out well. I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah. and yet here we are.
So coming to the next chapter, where you talk about nationalist sentiments that were nationalism in the in relation to the army. My question was, how was the rise of nationalist sentiment in the subcontinent really influencing the army's behavior, and how was this shaping the colonial policy towards the armies in particular?
Yeah, another great question. One of the major trends in the immediate post First World War period is a trend toward Indianization, a desire to make the leadership and the hierarchy of the Indian Army more pro-Indian, or at least like have officers that are Indian, not have a kind of sort of glass ceiling, if you will, on the level to which Indian soldiers can rise, whereas, British soldiers can be above it. There is a lot of pressure from Indian nationalists to make that a reality, especially after the First World War, because if you've been selling for 4 years of war, 5 years as we get into the Third Anglo-Afghan War, and soldiers are continuing to fight in various British mandates for decades, years and decades after, how do you legitimize that service? How do you continue to sell the narrative that the British Empire is good for soldiers and good for India if soldiers have been serving for years and risking their lives for years? So a lot of nationalists are putting pressure on the Indian Army and saying, if you want to make good on the promises that you've been giving to these soldiers, there has to be some tangible payout on this. And so Indianization becomes one method of saying, yes, there are changes. Yes, there is progress. And yes, this will help India get closer to that kind of always murky line of independence, because independence is always the carrot that's dangled as like, if you do these things, and independence is something we'll grant you maybe someday at some point, eventually, always in very ambiguous terms. And so Indianization becomes one of these promises. And so initially that means admitting Indian men to Sandhurst, which is the training center for officers in the United Kingdom. But then that evolves and it becomes establishing an Indian military academy within India itself, which opens in the 1930s. And so there's a desire to recruit and train more Indian officers, but at the same time, British leaders are constantly afraid that the men who would be attracted to the higher salaries and the higher esteem and the higher prestige that comes with being an officer might be men who are educated, who are literate, who have traveled, and who are anti-colonial. And so what the British end up doing is increasing the amount of education that they give to their soldiers and making religious education a normal part of soldiers' training, training young men, even younger. So men and boys from the age of like 10 and 11 start going into military schools and being trained. And the idea is that this is supposed to train men as young as possible to see the British as good, as beneficial, and to see the army as a legitimate career choice, and to ultimately support the empire as long as it exists. So it's a very tricky, delicate balance, because they're also trying to say, yes, you are Indians. Yes, you should be able to lead any man into battle, regardless of faith difference. But nonetheless, still view each other with some suspicion because we don't know who the nationalists are and we don't want them to influence you. So nationalists are constantly putting pressure on the army, which does result in some changes. But at the same time, the army tends to revert back to a lot of its older assumptions, and kind of just perpetuate and even deepen the differences between the communities and ensure that those divisions never really go away.
Well, before we can conclude, sorry for taking way beyond your time. Before we actually conclude, to just touch upon your last chapter, I just wanted to ask you about this theme that you explore in the last chapter about Hindus and Indianization. And I just wanted to understand how this categorization of certain races as military races was really influencing the larger community, or the majoritarian community of the Hindus.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, I think, which is that if, the army has been saying for decades, and increasingly so, that, Muslims are ideal soldiers, Sikhs are ideal soldiers, Nepali Gurkhas are ideal soldiers, there were constantly ways that they were saying Hindus are not, and initially it started with Brahmins are not, and there are some Hindus certainly that were considered good soldiers. Rajputs, for example, were always considered worthwhile. But there was a demographic skew within the army, which is that Hindus were a minority in the army, and that most of the Hindus that were recruited were actually Nepali Gurkhas. So Indian Hindus, despite being, a majority population in India, were always a minority in the army. And so this starts to shift somewhat with Indianization, as a greater number of Indian Hindus are actually testing quite well on the Indian military exams for training at the Indian Military Academy. And so this creates a lot of uncertainty on the part of British officers. Like, wait a minute, we've always been saying that Indian Hindus are bad for the army, and yet when we're trying to recruit officers who will command this army, Indian Hindus are actually doing quite well. And so what's going on is that because of these long-standing narratives of Indian Hindus aren't martial, Indian Hindus are effeminate, to use the kind of the terminology and dynamics explored by Minnie Sinha in her Colonial Masculinity, with the so-called effeminate Babu idea. There were these constant colonial narratives that Hindu men were not manly, they were not martial. And so by the early 20th century, there are a lot of Hindu reformist organizations and individuals and leaders who are trying to say, no, that's not true. We are martial, we are manly. Let's eat beef, let's do football, let's train in yoga, and prove that there are a variety of ways that Indian Hindu men can be martial. And in some cases, this leads to the forming of Indian military academies exclusively for Indian Hindus. And the idea is like, oh, we need to train Indian Hindus so they can catch up with, Sikhs and Muslims. But what's tricky about this, of course, is that they are the majority population, so when India is marching toward independence, when a lot of Indian Hindus become leaders of the Indian National Congress and Indian nationalist movements, suddenly those things look very different. It's not just about, oh, we're trying to get Indian Hindu men to be as strong and manly. Now it looks a lot more just like exclusionary and trying to keep, Sikhs and Muslims out, so that when independence does happen, do we now just have segregated communities, segregated institutions that are excluding those communities that had been previously valued by the British? And so that creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of dynamics, especially as we get close to the Second World War, where, the First World War, you had 1.4 million, which was a dramatic increase from the 100 to 250,000 that would serve in peacetime. By the Second World War, you get 2.4 million people that are serving in that conflict. And so a much wider cross-section of Indian society is coming into military service, bringing a lot of these ideas. And you have threaded throughout Indian society this kind of competition for who is the most martial, who is the most manly, which communities deserve to set the tone for independent India. And because of all of these martial race ideas, there is a competition for who is the biggest, who is the strongest, who can be the most violent. And those are the ones that should get to rule independent India, which have, tremendous and devastating consequences rooted in the colonial period.
Well, our last questions on the theme of your book was about the fascism and imperialism, about how fascism was becoming attractive in certain British military officials, and how the theories of racial difference was proving to be a strong link for that. So, if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think this is a dynamic that's been sort of threaded throughout the book, which is that if you combine these essentialized ideas about, these are the loyal communities, these are the martial communities, these are the communities that are most desirable, the most prized, it kind of folds very naturally into what becomes, the early to mid 20th century fascist outlook, which is that, people can be grouped, people can be controlled, society can be militarized. So I find it sort of unsurprising that in this context where a lot of British officers are encouraged to see populations as controllable, as distinct, that a lot of these British officers end up becoming attracted to fascism. And what I think is fascinating is that you can also see a parallel with a lot of the Indian officers that they are training. A lot of the Indian soldiers that they are training as well are sort of sharing those outlooks, and sharing these ideas of, in order to prove yourself, in order to be a man, in order to lead a nation, you have to be militant, you need to be martial, and you need to be exclusionary in your outlook. You can pick and choose who belongs in the state. And so I think it's very scary that at this moment of global war, by the late 1930s and then into the 1940s, which is also 1940s, the moment of Indian partition and independence, that these ideas have been kind of pervading colonial society and the rank and file in ways that I think are very frightening, which, then we see a lot of violence around partition, and a lot of horror and a lot of devastation, often coming from men who had served in the military. And so kind of just peeling that back and thinking a little bit about the militarization of a society and how fascist outlooks have been sort of pervading various elements of the military and its organization and its outlook. For me, it's, very informative and also helps explain why the period was so violent and tragic.
Thank you so much. So this brings us to the last set of questions in conclusion. I just wanted to discuss the relevance of this particular project in contemporary world, and why is it necessary for anyone to basically come to realize about the military history of South Asia and the intricacies with kind of religion and culture and the small little nitty-gritty details that it comes with, and to see it as not something that has always been painted in binaries, but something that's with complexities. So what kind of relevance does the work hold today?
Yeah, I think it holds a lot of relevance, and not to overstate my case, but I think anytime we're interested in any historical subject, it's because it resonates with us and how we see the world and the world around us. And so, we still live in a world with massive militaries. We still live in a world with hard national borders. And, I think we very much live in a world where understandings of faith are playing a very large role in politics and in a variety of places. And, in the United States, for instance, like targeting which, people can come from which countries that have certain majority populations defined by faith. I think these ideas are very much pervading a lot of the assumptions of how different governments are run, who gets to go where, what governments work with what governments. So we live in a world that has nations, that has militaries, that has borders. And all of these things tend to be, anti-human in a very fundamental way, and anti, the complexity and the nuance and the messiness of human existence. So all of these things are about creating categories and creating divisions and creating differences. So this book hopefully reminds us that these things aren't necessarily for the betterment of all people, and that once we find ourselves falling into these same colonial patterns, that those don't go the way as intended. They never go the way as intended. They tend to have all sorts of unintended consequences, which generally make things worse, not better.
Thank you about that. So one final question before I can ask you for a little advice, is that you already previously mentioned at the beginning of the conversation as the work you're currently working on. So what is the next thing that we can look forward from your work that we can keep an eye out for?
Yeah, of course. So my next book, it's tentatively called Losing Hearts and Minds. And so it looks at the military and cultural history of Southeast Asia, and particularly Singapore and Malaya, which were sites of some of the most instrumental and influential military conflicts of the 20th century. So you have the fall of Singapore, you have in the Second World War. You have the Singapore Mutiny in 1915, and then you also have the Malayan Emergency, which was one of the major anti-communist conflicts that sort of predated and then tremendously influenced the U.S. war in Vietnam. So you have all of these moments of great influence in military history that are all happening in one place, which is also a kind of moving point for soldiers from around the empire. So Indian soldiers, very influential in 1915 and in 1942. Nepali Gurkha soldiers are still there in the Malayan Emergency. And then you also have soldiers from Africa, from Australia, and truly a global movement of soldiers coming into this relatively small part of the world. So I want to look at how militaries are formed in the 20th century, how they interact with civilians, and how that creates a lot of, again, unintended consequences for our present realities.
Thank you so much, and we wish you all the best of luck for your upcoming work.
Thank you.
So, the last question is, what kind of advice would you give to a student who wants to, say, pursue military history, especially, say, of not just particularly South Asia regionally, but overall 20th century colonial military history and how these militaries were basically managed? So something that they could early on look out for, something, sources, books, or whatever that you may have as advice.
Yeah, so one is that I mentioned earlier, which is just try and find as much as you can that's been digitized. Look at the libraries and archives that exist in your field, and start looking around and asking around, because there are all sorts of great databases that are out there that have a tremendous amount of digitized newspapers, oral histories, digitized material culture. So I definitely recommend that. But from a kind of broader conceptual point, if you're doing military history, or if you're doing cultural history and you're a graduate student, I would say be as open to as many interpretations as possible. Learn from as many different outlooks and approaches as you can while you can. Because I think, something that I see in various fields, that there's only one way that you can be a military historian, or there's only one way that you can be a historian of South Asia, maybe. And I think that can be limiting, especially when you're a graduate student and you're learning. I think as a graduate student, learn as many different approaches as you can and find which ones work for you, because that's probably where you'll find the passion in your project. And that's also probably where you'll find the new insight that will help other scholars move forward.
Thank you so much. This brings us to the end of our episode and podcast. I really appreciate you taking so much time for coming and joining us on the call. I apologize if I took a little longer than we might have anticipated this call might have went for, but it was a really exciting conversation, and I definitely love the book. I really want to get back to the book in detail and make sure that I read every single page of it. But I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm really grateful for giving us the opportunity to interview you. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you nothing but the best for your continued success with the podcast and for your future studies as well.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for tuning into our episode and conversation with Dr. Kate Imy. I really hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please consider subscribing to our channel and podcast for more such amazing content. Check out our website www.indiacolonized.com for more on South Asia's colonial history. If any of you listeners are interested to work with us, we've recently started a rolling volunteering program for students and others in areas of research. For details on the program, please go to our website www.indiacolonized.com. That's colonized with an S. Do consider following us on our social media sites for more exciting updates and information on South Asia's colonial history. So until next time, stay safe, stay curious.